She collapsed beside a dusty water trough, sunburned, starving, and barely conscious, just feet from a stranger's porch. He didn't ask who she was, just carried her inside, fed her, and said nothing. But what he did next will shock even those who thought they'd seen everything. But first, let's go back to the beginning. Sarah Whitlow hadn't cried when the wedding was arranged, not when the ink dried on the marriage contract, not when her father, once a soldier, now a merchant of daughters, pressed a cold kiss to her forehead and muttered, "You'll be grateful one day." She hadn't cried even when seamstresses tugged ivory silk over her frame, measuring her shoulders like livestock, whispering that the dress would hide what needed hiding. No, Sarah hadn't cried, because crying meant hope, and she'd already buried that in the same shallow grave where she left her girlhood. Curtis Deal was a man whose wealth had fermented like old wine, potent, sharp, and soured by the years. He didn't smile with kindness, only with possession. He wore rings too tight for his fingers, boots too polished for real work, and a smell of cigar ash and entitlement that clung to every room he entered. "You'll have land," her father said. "You'll be safe." But safe, to Sarah, sounded an awful lot like trapped. In her room that final night, beneath the dim glow of an oil lamp, she found the photograph. Her mother, young, before the fever, before silence replaced her laughter. Sarah ran her thumb across the paper, tracing her mother's smile as if it might teach her how to feel anything but dread. "Mama," she whispered, the first crack in her composure. "This isn't the life you wanted for me." And then the tears came, hot, fast, quiet. She didn't sob. She wept like someone mourning the loss of herself. She packed lightly, some coins, her mother's worn Bible, a bread roll gone dry at the edges. She stole a mare from the neighbor's paddock, whispering thanks to the dark for hiding her. The sky above was black velvet, the stars pricking her like questions she couldn't answer. She rode hard, dust choking her throat, wind biting her cheeks. Each hoofbeat against the earth was a prayer and a curse. By the second day, her lips cracked, her body trembled, her skin blistered beneath a sun that seemed to mock her rebellion. But still she pressed on, as if the horizon itself might grant her absolution. When the horse finally buckled near a lonely patch of fence and faded prairie, Sarah rolled to the dirt, clutching the satchel like it might anchor her to the world. She didn't notice the man on the porch, the one who paused with a mug of coffee halfway to his lips, watching her crumple beside his trough. Everett Langston didn't call out. He didn't ask who she was. He simply set down his coffee and walked toward the broken stranger the wind had delivered to his doorstep. The barn was warmer than it had any right to be in those cold weeks, as if the hay had memorized the heat of past summers and held it for her. Everett hadn't given her a room. He'd given her space, a folded quilt laid over fresh straw, a bucket of water exchanged each morning, and a chipped blue basin for washing, its rim worn smooth by other hands, other histories. He left bread on a plate, still warm some mornings. Once, a ripe pear. She never heard him come or go. It was like living in the hush between two breaths. Sarah didn't speak. Not because she couldn't, but because she was waiting for the price. The questions, the hand on her arm that lingered a little too long. That moment always came, eventually. But it never did here. Everett Langston moved through his days with the unassuming stillness of someone who had made peace with silence. His words were few, chosen like seeds for their yield. The first morning she awoke, the barn doors were cracked open and light spilled in like honey. A bowl of oatmeal sat on the threshold, steam curling like a ribbon. Beside it, a folded note in coarse pencil on brown wrapping paper. "Stay as long as you need. Don't worry about talking." She read it 3 times, her thumb brushing the corner until the edge softened under the weight of disbelief. She stayed. At night, she watched him from the loft as he moved about the yard below, feeding the chickens, rubbing Chester's side as the dog leaned into him with quiet gratitude. Chester's back leg was missing clean at the joint, not a wound but an old abscess, healed and adapted to. Sarah wondered if Everett was the same, missing something invisible, walking with a limp that didn't touch his stride. When he passed her in the yard, he touched the brim of his hat but never tried to catch her eyes. He never looked through her either. He just saw her. It was more unnerving than suspicion, and yet it was the fence that changed her. It was a cold morning, and frost had silvered the posts. Everett stood there with wire in hand, no instruction, just a second pair of gloves held out, as if to say, "You can help if you want." She took them, wordless. They worked for an hour. Nothing was spoken, but when they paused, she caught him glancing at her fingers, red and raw. He handed her a tin of balm and said, "It stings more before it heals." That night, wrapped in the quilt that smelled faintly of cedar and dust, Sarah pressed her face into her knees and wept. Not from fear, not even from shame, but from a sudden overwhelming ache. For all the years she'd mistaken silence for indifference, and kindness for something that had to be earned. Everett had given freely, without permission, without demand, and she no longer knew what to do with it. The first frost whispered over the hills a week too soon that year, painting the pumpkins white and pressing breath into the window panes. Autumn hadn't asked permission to arrive early, just as Sarah hadn't asked for the way Everett began to look at her with the kind of quiet steadiness that made a woman feel more than seen. It was the time of the harvest dance, a tradition she'd heard about only in fragments from the mercantile clerk and passing townsfolk, all of whom still watched her like she was a ghost who hadn't realized she was dead yet. She hadn't planned to go. Her old dress hung from her like a memory that wouldn't fade. Dull blue, thin at the seams, patched at the hem with mismatched thread. The sort of thing people noticed not because it was ugly, but because it was a reminder. She didn't belong here. Not among women who wore ribboned bonnets and lace gloves, not among girls who hadn't been bartered like cattle. But that morning, as she smoothed the quilt on her cot and brushed straw from the boards beneath, she found it. A calico dress folded with impossible care, soft, pale rose with a modest collar and sleeves she could roll up for work. It wasn't the kind of dress that demanded attention. It was the kind that asked for kindness, the kind that whispered dignity. Tucked into the sleeve was a single scrap of paper. "You're not what they say. You never were." She didn't cry. Not then. But she touched the fabric like it might vanish if she blinked too hard. The town hall was already glowing when they arrived, warm light spilling from the open doors, the fiddle music barely covering the sound of conversations snapping like dry twigs. Sarah walked beside Everett, their arms loosely linked, not possessive, not performative, just together. But still, every head turned. Curtis stood near the far wall, his arm curled like a leash around the waist of a girl barely out of her girlhood. His mouth twisted when he saw Sarah, and his voice was sharp and venom-sweet. "You got nerve showing your face here." Before she could speak, Everett stepped forward. "She's got more right to stand here than you ever will." There was no raise in his voice, no bark or fury, just the certainty of a man who'd already made peace with the truth and didn't feel the need to explain it twice. Later, away from the lights, behind the hall where lanterns gave way to starlight and silence, he reached for her hand. "I ain't good with words," he said, his voice low, raw like a man unused to asking for things. "But I want you to stay, as my wife, if you'd want that." Sarah's breath caught. "Why?" she asked, not out of disbelief but hunger. "You barely know me." Everett looked at her then, not at her face but into it. "I know how you fix the porch steps without telling me. I know how you hum when you make coffee. I know how you cry quiet so no one hears." He paused, searching for more, but settled on what mattered. "And I want to spend the rest of my life knowing the rest." And for the first time in years, Sarah felt something loosen inside her chest. Not her fear, her name. The morning light fell gently over the porch, painting long shadows that stretched toward the edge of the pasture like fingers reaching for yesterday. Sarah Langston stood barefoot on the smooth, worn boards, her skirt dusted with flour, a peach pie cooling in one hand, and Everett's son resting against her hip. The baby's breath was slow and even, his small hand curled into the folds of her apron as if he had always belonged there. And perhaps he had. Some lives begin not at birth, but at the moment a woman chooses to live without fear. She looked out at the field, where Everett was fixing a fence post, Chester limping loyally behind. The breeze tugged at her sun hat, carrying with it the scent of earth and sage and something deeper, something like peace. It had been a year since the harvest dance. A year since she'd walked into town not as a scandal, not as a fugitive, but as a woman beside a man who had chosen her without question. That year, the drought came hard. Curtis Deal lost nearly half his herd and all his swagger. Her father's letters stopped arriving, each silence more deafening than the last. But Sarah no longer flinched at silence. She had learned to fill it with laughter. With the rustle of quilt squares being stitched by hand, with the soft lullabies she hummed while kneading dough at dawn. Sundays brought neighbors by the dozen, not because they needed eggs or milk, but because something in the air at the Langston place felt right. Folks stayed longer than they meant to, sipping coffee under the eaves, lingering over stories, letting their children nap under Sarah's quilts. Some asked Everett for advice. Others brought Sarah new fabric scraps, knowing she'd turn them into beauty. They stopped calling her that girl who ran. Now she was Sarah Langston, the woman who grew herbs in tea tins, who knew how to calm a crying child with just her voice, who stitched her own joy into every curtain and cradle. On their 5th anniversary, Everett handed her a small cedar box. The hinges creaked with memory. Inside lay her old satchel, faded canvas, worn strap, the stitching frayed where her thumb had once rubbed every night to remind herself she was still real. "I kept it," he said, not quite meeting her gaze. "Not to remind you of where you came from, but so you never forget how far you've come." Her fingers trembled around the handle. She reached for his hand, calloused and warm, kissed the old scar that ran along his brow like a trail that led straight to home. "Thank you," she whispered, "for giving me your name." He smiled, eyes lined with dust and sunlight. "You gave it meaning."